Welcome back to Diabetic Food Files, the podcast where toes tell the truth, wounds tell their secrets, literally, and limb salvage is not a miracle, it's a marathon. I'm your host, Dr. G, and today we're going to talk about an antibiotic that doesn't really get enough respect. And honestly, I don't think it's available in the States, unfortunately, or I don't think it's FDA approved, but I believe they can get it from compounding pharmacies. But it is quietly changed the way we treat staph infections, especially on the skin, especially in wounds, especially in diabetic feet. So today's episode is about an antibiotic I know people rarely know about, but I know dermatologists know about, and it's fusidic acid, the quiet staph assassin. So hopefully by the end of this episode, you'll understand where it came from, how it works, why it's still used, and why it got misused. Okay? So let's stage the medicine behind it and how it was discovered. So let's rewind the clock. It was back in the 1950s to early 1960s. Penicillin has already made its moment. Doctors think they have won the war on infection. Hospitals are optimistic, a little too optimistic. And then Staphylococcus aureus shows up and says, yeah, cute optimism, right? Watch this. And so penicillin resistance started creeping up. Hospitals started seeing skin infections. They started seeing post-surgical infection. I really believe they always saw post-surgical infections because the way things, remember, they used to start off with hand washing as well, right? They started seeing osteomyelitis and that were no longer responding to the penicillin. And this is when pharmaceutical science does what it always does in crisis. It goes back to nature because a lot of it is made from nature, right? Like soil, molds, and fungi, because nature has been fighting bacteria longer than humans have. So in 1962, researchers in the United Kingdom were able to isolate a compound from a fungus called Fusidium coccineum. And I'm sorry I pronounced that not right, but Fusidium coccineum. I'm going to spell it Fusidium coccineum, Coccinium. So Fusidium coccineum, that is a fungus. So it's not a flashy name, it's not famous, but it's actually quite powerful. So this compound extracted from this fungus showed something that was quite remarkable. It stopped Staphylococcus aureus dead in its track. Even strains that were already resistant to penicillin. That's where they got the compound name fusidic acid. The name literally comes from the fungus itself. So here's where it gets interesting. When chemists looked at fusidic acid structure, they noticed something weird about it. It looked like a steroid, its chemical structure, but it had zero steroid activity and no anti-inflammatory activity, no glucocorticoid effect, just antibacterial. So why is fusidic acid different? Here's the part I want you to lean in and understand about fusidic acid and why it matters. Most antibiotics at that time did one of three things. They attacked the cell wall, they messed up the DNA, or they disrupted the ribosomes directly. Fusidic acid did none of that. Instead, fusidic acid targeted something called elongated factor G. So EFG, elongated factor G. So let me slow it down. So protein synthesis in bacteria happens in stages. Stage one is initiation, stage two is elongation, and stage three is termination. Fusidic acid blocks the elongation phase. So specifically, it prevents elongation factor G from releasing from the ribosome. This freezes the ribosome in place. The translation cannot continue. Protein synthesis halts, and the bacteria cannot survive. So, this is a very unique mechanism. This mechanism does not overlap with beta lactam, macrolides, fluoroquinolones, or aminoglycosides. That's why fusidic acid historically has had a very low cross resistance. It's primarily bacteriostatic, but in high concentrations, particularly topically, it can become bactericidal. This protein is essentially for the bacterial protein synthesis, and it's blocking that. So think of it like this: the ribosome is a factory. The protein synthesis is an assembly line, and elongation factor G is the conveyor belt. And fusidic acid locks the conveyor belt in place. So there's no movement, there's no protein, there's no growth. The bacteria doesn't explode, it doesn't lyse, it just stops. And that's why fusidic acid is primary bacteriostatic. So I think you can get that, right? Fusidic acid is bacteriostatic, means it's stopping it in its tracks, right? So, but it has a day the best actually quite effective against gram-positive cocci, especially Staphylococcus aureus. And here's why this is huge. There was no cross-resistance with beta-lactams. So bacteria that laughed at penicillin had no idea what to do with fusidic acid. So one clinician saw the data when it came to fusidic acid and moved fast. And in the UK and Europe, it was adopted quickly. Dermatology embraced it, wound care embraced it, orthopedics embraced it. Topical formulations came first, creams and ointments, perfect for impetigo, infected eczema, and superficial wound infections. And for the first time, doctors had a targeted weapon that wasn't like a nuclear bomb. Then came the oral versions and the IV forms, and now we're talking about serious infections like deep staph infections, osteomyelitis, prosthetic joint infections. But here's where clinicians learned an early lesson. Fusidic acid should not be used alone systemically because bacteria is very clever. Used alone, it develops a resistance very quickly. So clinicians began pairing it with our one of our favorites, rifampicin. Okay, and the two different mechanisms. One blocks the protein synthesis, and the other one hits the RNA polymerase enzyme, and the combo became legendary in bone and joint infections. So when it comes to dosing, and leave the dosing for the clinicians, the medical professionals, okay? But this is just for educational purposes only. Common sense is common, right? So topical, they usually use it in a 2% ointment, apply 2 to 3 times a day. Maximum duration of use of that is 5 to 10 days. Anything longer, you're going to increase the risk of resistance. And then oral, they have a 500 milligram used every 8 to 12 hours, just depending on your physician. You have to monitor the liver enzyme because, like you said, if you see fusidic acid prescribed alone systemically, that's a red flag. Like the person doesn't know what they're doing, to be honest. So fusidic acid is used widely in the United Kingdom, Europe, Australia, Middle East, the Caribbean, and Asia. But in the United States, it's not FDA approved. Let me just say it again. In the United States, it's not FDA approved. So it's available only via compounding or international access. And that's why clinicians often default to mupirocin and why resistant patterns differ globally. So why is the US cautious about fusidic acid? Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. So why didn't fusidic acid blow up in United States for use medically, right? Simple. The US had already learned resistant patterns, and early data showed that monotherapy misuse led to rapid resistance. So regulators were cautious, and topical use remained limited, and systemic use never became mainstream. So meanwhile, Europe leaned into stewardship, shortcut courses, targeted use, but two philosophies, two outcomes. So that's why they don't really use it in the US. And this is where fusidic acid found its home forever when it's transitioned to wound care and diabetic feet. So in wound care, especially in diabetic feet, chronic ulcers, colonized wounds with Staphylococcus aureus dominance, it penetrates skin beautifully like butter, yummy, yummy. And minimally systemic absorption and high local concentration. Like that sounds like a win-win, right? But when used correctly, and remember, AKA short duration, and appropriate indication and culture guided. Okay. It works quietly and effectively. But let's be clear, Fusidic acid resistance did not appear overnight. It's actually manufactured by human behavior. People forget about that. So, topical fusidic acid was very easy, cheap, effective, comforting. So, what's happening? People were using it without culture. They were using it for too long. They kept repeatedly using it. It was used for colonization, not infection. It was used for like eczema, rashes, scratches, and everything. And people treated redness, not the actual bacteria. And Staphylococcus aureus is not stupid. Resistance developed primarily through mutations in the elongated factor G, altered binding sites, and reduced affinity for fusidic acid. And once the elongated factor G changes shape, the fusidic acid cannot lock the conveyor belt anymore, and the bacteria keeps on moving. And so this is like classic Darwinism, right? Survival of the fittest, right? So the survivors were selected and were able to replicate and make resistance. So topical antibiotics are not harmless. Don't ever think that. Okay, just because it's topical doesn't mean it's harmless. Topical fusidic acid as a monotherapy, especially if you have it in a prolonged long-term use, creates what they call localized resistant reservoirs. And this means the skin has become a training ground for resistant staphylococcus. So later, when the same patient develops a diabetic foot ulcer, cellulitis, osteomyelitis, they already are armed for the enemy. And yes, that happens very quietly and the treatment failure later. So why systemic use required with a combination when it comes to using fusidic acid? So systemic fusidic acid, taught clinicians very early on, never use it alone. Okay. Let's say this antibiotic is codependent. Okay. So why? Because resistance emerged very fast with monotherapy with this antibiotic. So clinicians paired it with rifampicin, sometimes with beta-lactam or glycopeptide, because the different mechanisms, different targets, this slows down the resistance dramatically. And this is where stewardship was born, and before stewardship even had a name. So, what are the modern guidelines when it comes to fusidic acid? So, fast forward today, modern guidelines is topical fusidic acid, short term course only. Big and bold, short term course only. Avoid repeated use, avoid chronic use, avoid empiric use without signs of infection. Do not use for colonization. Do not use for venous stasis, dermatitis, redness. Okay. In wound care, this means drainage, no. Infection. If there's odor, no. Like, don't use it for that. Okay. You have to culture first, debride first, offload first, and antibiotics come after the fundamentals. So let's compare. So fusidic acid is excellent. It has excellent anti-staph activity, especially with MSSA, not they have some MRSA activities, but it works better with MSSA, okay, not MRSA. Some MRSA activity depending on the region. Listen to that, depending on the region. But it does have high skin penetration, but resistance develops faster than some alternatives. That means that fusidic acid is a scalpel, not a hammer, okay? You got to know when to use it, got to know when to cut, right? So what does this mean for diabetic foot? In diabetic foot care, lesson is everything. So you're not just treating a rash, you're not just treating redness, you're not just treating a limb on a timeline. Every unnecessary antibiotic that is used on a patient alters the patient's flora, brings up selected resistance, complicates future infections, and increases the patient's amputation risk. And I'm not just being dramatic, I'm being like, this is physiology. So what does the latest research when it comes to fusidic acid says? So resistance is actually real. It develops rapidly with prolonged topical use, recurrent impetigo treatment, chronic eczema misuse, and monotherapy systemic use. When it comes to MRSA activity, like we said, it's still useful, but it's region dependent. Okay, it's more better for MSSA, not MRSA, for MSSA. Biofilm limitation. So fusidic acid does not penetrate biofilms well, unfortunately. And remember, that's one of our biggest speed bumps to get over when it comes to cleaning the wound, healing it, getting through any topical antibiotic to that wound. So this means like chronic diabetic foot ulcers, venous stasis ulcers, and hardware associated wounds, they need debridement, biofilm disruption, moisture balance, perfusion, and offloading. Microbiome disruption, so prolonged use disrupts the normal flora. Prolonged use actually increases fungal overgrowth, and prolonged use of this topical encourages gram-negative colonization. So it's not a benign thing. You can't just slap it on there. So if you remember anything, topical antibiotics do not heal diabetic foot ulcers, okay? They are temporarily to help reduce the surface bioburden. So bioburden. So they do nothing when it comes to ischemia. They don't help with pressure. They don't help with glycemic toxicity. It does not help with neuropathy and does not help with structural deformities. See, there's so much things we have to address at the same time when it comes to the diabetic foot ulcer. But in diabetic foot wound care, you can use this for short-term base only and only if there is a clear indication for it. Never use it as a substitute for fundamentals, okay? So let's do some quick high yield board questions. Okay, I think everybody will get this one. Fusidic acid inhibits which bacterial factor? Just think of me, Dr. G. It inhibits elongation factor T. Okay, so factor T, factor G. So next question, resistance to fusidic acid develops fastest with A, topical short courses, term courses, B, combination therapy, C, monotherapy, prolonged use, or D, IV administration. The answer is C, monotherapy, prolonged use. That will help fusidic acid develop resistance the fastest. So remember, short-term course only, right? Fusidic acid is most effective against what? A. Pseudomonas, B. Candida, C. Staphylococcus aureus, or D. Enterococcus. The answer is C. Staphylococcus aureus. True or false? Fusidic acid has anti-inflammatory properties. Answer is false. Next and last question. In diabetic foot ulcers, fusidic acid should be used in A, a chronic maintenance, B, instead of debridement. Absolutely not. My brain just automatically says that. C, short term only when indicated, or D, for biofilm eradication. The answer is C, short term only when indicated. So hopefully that helps. So this is diabetic foot files. I'm sure this was a lot, but now you know a little bit about fusidic acid, something that people rarely hear about. I learned about it because I was just researching because I had a patient who was very resistant to things. I needed something cheap. I needed something that just I never heard of. I was just like kept on doing research and I saw a research article about it and I was just like, oh, it covers this, covers that. And I was like, where is this? And I was like, oh, it's not available in the States. I was like, oh my gosh. But it's very interesting how certain countries have their own approvals for certain medication, but it is a good thing to have in your toolbox, in my opinion. So now you know how the resistance works, when to use it, short term only, how it compares to mupirocin and other topicals, and what it teaches us about antibiotic stewardship in limb salvage. Because remember, it plays a huge role, and it's actually something that they're trying to address for the future because they see this antibiotic resistance continuing on in the future. So we don't want that. Okay, so let's not let antibiotics fail us. Remember, resistance is a human behavior problem that we manufactured, okay? So this is Diabetic Foot Files. This is Dr. G, and take care of your feet because they take care of you.